In the autumn of 1856, authorities in rural Medina County, Ohio, made a discovery so horrific that local newspapers refused to print the full details for nearly 3 decades. What they found buried beneath the Grimby home for displaced children would challenge everything the community believed about charity, family, and the very nature of evil itself. 23 small graves, unmarked and hastily covered, contained the remains of children who had supposedly been transferred to families out west. Children whose names had been carefully erased from all official records. The Grimby family, pillars of their Methodist community and recipients of state funding for their charitable work, had been operating something far more sinister than an orphanage. Before we continue with the story of the Grimby family and their house of horrors, if you're fascinated by these dark chapters of American history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because stories like this happen in small towns across our entire nation. The discovery would remain buried in county records for generations, too disturbing for a young nation still finding its moral footing in the tumultuous decade before the Civil War. Medina County in 1856 sat at the crossroads of America's expansion westward, where the old Puritan values of New England collided with the rough pragmatism of frontier life. The county, established just 3 decades earlier, was home to barely 8,000 souls scattered across dense forests and modest farming settlements. Most families struggled to carve out a living from the unforgiving Ohio soil, and the harsh winters regularly claimed lives among the elderly and infirm. The Grimby home for displaced children stood 3 miles outside the county seat of Medina, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through thick stands of oak and maple. Established in 1851 by Jeremiah and Martha Grimby, the institution had earned a reputation throughout northeastern Ohio as a beacon of Christian charity. Jeremiah, a tall, severe man with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely white hair, had arrived in Ohio from Vermont with impeccable references from religious leaders. His wife, Martha, small and nervous with quick darting movements, rarely spoke above a whisper, but was known for her apparent devotion to the children in their care. The couple's adult son, Caleb Grimby, assisted in running the orphanage. At 28, Caleb possessed his father's imposing height, but with a disturbing intensity that made even longtime neighbors uncomfortable. His pale blue eyes seemed to catalog every movement, every expression, every weakness in those around him. Unlike his parents, who maintained the facade of pious respectability, Caleb made no effort to hide his contempt for what he called the weak and the unwanted. The Grimby operation appeared exemplary from the outside. State inspectors who visited annually consistently praised the family's dedication to caring for Ohio's most vulnerable children. The Grimsbys received regular funding from both state coffers and private Methodist donors, money that supposedly went toward food, clothing, education, and medical care for the 30 to 40 children housed there at any given time. What made the Grimby home unique was their specialty in difficult placements. Children who had proven troublesome in other institutions, those with physical deformities, or those whose traumatic backgrounds had left them withdrawn and suspicious of adults. Other orphanages gladly transferred their most challenging cases to the Grims, praising their patience and apparent success in rehabilitating damaged children. The children who arrived at the Grimby home came from across Ohio and beyond, victims of cholera epidemics that had swept through Cincinnati and Cleveland, survivors of house fires and industrial accidents, and the offspring of families torn apart by poverty or alcoholism. Many arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and memories they tried desperately to forget. The Grimbys seemed to welcome these broken souls with open arms, promising them safety, education, and eventually placement with loving families heading west to claim homestead land. Local residents occasionally noticed the unusual quiet that surrounded the Grimby property. Unlike other children's institutions where laughter and play could be heard from the road, the Grimby home maintained an almost funeral silence. When questioned about this, Jeremiah would explain that their children were learning discipline and respect, qualities essential for their future success as productive citizens. The explanation satisfied most inquiries, particularly from those who preferred not to examine too closely the darker corners of their community's charitable work. The first crack in the Grimby facade appeared in late September 1856, when a traveling photographer named Edmund Hartwell arrived in Medina County to document the region's institutions for a survey commissioned by the Ohio Department of Public Welfare. Hartwell, a meticulous man from Cincinnati with a reputation for thoroughness, had already photographed dozens of schools, poorhouses, and orphanages across the state. His photographs would be used to illustrate a comprehensive report on the conditions of Ohio's dependent populations, a progressive effort that placed Ohio at the forefront of social reform. On a crisp Thursday morning, Hartwell loaded his cumbersome camera equipment onto a hired wagon and set out for the Grimby home. The driver, a local man named Tom Bradshaw, had never actually visited the orphanage despite living in the area for 15 years. "Strange how quiet it always is out there," Bradshaw mentioned as they navigated the rooted road. "My wife says she's never seen the children playing outside, not once in all the years they've been operating." As they approached the property, Hartwell immediately noticed the institutional character of the main building. A large 3-story structure painted an uninviting gray with small windows that seemed designed more for containment than illumination. A smaller building, presumably for staff quarters, sat behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway. The grounds themselves were eerily maintained, not a single toy, swing, or evidence of children's activities visible anywhere. Jeremiah Grimby met them at the front door, his tall frame filling the doorway as he examined Hartwell's credentials with obvious displeasure. "We weren't expecting any official visits," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man unaccustomed to having his routine disrupted. "Our children are currently engaged in their lessons, and I prefer not to disturb their education for unnecessary photographs." Hartwell, experienced in dealing with reluctant administrators, produced his official letter of authorization from the state capitol. "I assure you, Mr. Grimby, this is entirely routine. I simply need to document your facilities and perhaps photograph a few children at their studies. Nothing disruptive." The negotiation continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which Hartwell became increasingly aware of the absolute silence emanating from the supposedly occupied building. No footsteps, no voices, no sounds of activity whatsoever. When he commented on this, Martha Grimby appeared beside her husband, wringing her hands nervously. "Our children are very well disciplined," she whispered. "They know better than to cause disturbances during lesson time." Eventually, Jeremiah relented, but under strict conditions. Hartwell could photograph the main classroom and dining hall, but only when empty. He could not speak to any children directly, and Caleb would escort him throughout the visit to ensure he didn't wander into unauthorized areas. "Some of our children have suffered terrible traumas," Jeremiah explained. "Unexpected encounters with strangers can trigger episodes of hysteria that take days to resolve." The interior of the building struck Hartwell as more prison than orphanage. Long, narrow corridors stretched in both directions from the main entrance, lined with heavy wooden doors that bore no identifying marks or windows. The walls were bare of any decoration, no children's artwork, no cheerful posters, nothing to suggest this was a place where young people lived and learned. The air carried a strange mixture of pine oil disinfectant and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Hartwell couldn't quite identify. Caleb Grimby led him first to the classroom. A large room on the second floor furnished with 30 wooden desks arranged in perfect rows. Each desk was identical, equipped with a slate and chalk, and positioned to face a simple wooden podium at the front. "Where are the children's personal belongings?" Hartwell asked, noticing the complete absence of books, papers, or any evidence of individual students. "We maintain strict organization," Caleb replied, his pale eyes never leaving Hartwell's face. "Personal possessions lead to theft and fighting. Everything they need is provided when they need it." As Hartwell set up his camera equipment, he became aware of faint sounds from somewhere deeper in the building, not the cheerful noises of children at play, but something more disturbing. Soft moaning, occasional coughing, and what sounded like quiet sobbing. When he mentioned these sounds, Caleb's expression hardened. "Some of our residents are currently unwell," he said tersely. "We maintain a small infirmary for those requiring medical attention." The dining hall on the first floor proved equally unsettling. Long wooden tables with attached benches could accommodate perhaps 40 people, but the room felt more like a military mausolée than a place where children took their meals. The serving area consisted of a simple counter with large pots and ladles. No evidence of varied meals or consideration for individual preferences. Most disturbing to Hartwell was the complete absence of any mess or ware that would indicate regular use by dozens of children. As he prepared to photograph the dining hall, Hartwell made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While adjusting his camera angle, he dropped a lens cap that rolled under one of the long tables. As he bent to retrieve it, his hand encountered something carved into the wooden bench, small letters scratched into the surface with what must have been a nail or sharp stone. In the dim light filtering through the small windows, he could just make out the words, "Help us." The disturbing encounter at the Grimby home left Edmund Hartwell deeply unsettled, but it would be 3 weeks before he could act on his suspicions. Upon returning to Cincinnati, he found himself overwhelmed with the mundane tasks of developing photographs and preparing his official report. Yet the memory of that carved plea for help, the unnatural silence of the institution, and the family's obvious attempts to conceal something gnawed at his conscience. Hartwell's first attempt to investigate came through his professional connections. He contacted colleagues who had photographed other Ohio orphanages, asking specifically about their experiences and what they considered normal operations. Without exception, every photographer reported busy, noisy institutions where children's voices could be heard throughout their visits, where evidence of play and learning was abundant, and where administrators were eager to showcase their success stories. Growing more concerned, Hartwell reached out to the Ohio Department of Public Welfare, specifically to a clerk named Samuel Hutchkins, who handled orphanage inspections. Their conversation, conducted over lunch in a downtown Cincinnati tavern, revealed troubling gaps in the official oversight of the Grimby operation. "The thing about the Grimby home," Hutchkins explained, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "is that they never seem to have problems. No diseases, outbreaks, no disciplinary issues, no requests for additional funding or support. In 15 years of handling these institutions, I've never encountered one that runs so smoothly." When Hartwell pressed for details about the annual inspections, Hutchins' expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, that's just it. The inspections are always perfect. Too perfect, if you ask me. Every child accounted for, all records meticulously maintained, facilities spotless." But he paused, looking around the tavern as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I've never actually seen the same child twice during my visits. And when I ask about specific children from previous years, there's always an explanation. Transferred to families out west, sent to relatives, that sort of thing." This revelation prompted Hartwell to examine the transfer records more carefully. What he discovered was a pattern so consistent, it defied statistical probability. According to official documents, the Grimby home had successfully placed 127 children with families over the past 5 years, an exceptional success rate that made them the envy of similar institutions across Ohio. However, every single placement was described as being with farming families in territories west of Ohio, locations vague enough to make verification impossible. More disturbing was the complete absence of follow-up correspondence. Other orphanages routinely received letters from placed children or their new families, updates on progress, requests for additional medical or educational records. The Grimby home's files contained no such correspondence, not a single letter from any of the 127 children they claimed to have successfully placed. Hartwell's investigation began to consume his thoughts and his time. He spent evenings in Cincinnati's public houses, listening to conversations among travelers, teamsters, and merchants who regularly conducted business along the western routes. His casual inquiries about families adopting orphaned children from Ohio institutions yielded disturbing results. Several men claimed to have transported children westward from other orphanages, but none could recall any dealings with the Grimby operation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: transferred to families out west, sent to relatives, that sort of thing. This revelation prompted Hartwell to examine the transfer records more carefully. What he discovered was a pattern so consistent, it defied statistical probability. According to official documents, the Grimby home had successfully placed 127 children with families over the past 5 years, an exceptional success rate that made them the envy of similar institutions across Ohio. However, every single placement was described as being with farming families in territories west of Ohio, locations vague enough to make verification impossible. More disturbing was the complete absence of follow-up correspondence. Other orphanages routinely received letters from placed children or their new families, updates on progress, requests for additional medical or educational records. The Grimby home's files contained no such correspondence. Not a single letter from any of the 127 children they claimed to have successfully placed. Hartwell's investigation began to consume his thoughts and his time. He spent evenings in Cincinnati's public houses, listening to conversations among travelers, teamsters, and merchants who regularly conducted business along the western routes. His casual inquiries about families adopting orphan children from Ohio institutions yielded disturbing results. Several men claimed to have transported children westward from other orphanages, but none could recall any dealings with the Grimby operation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While examining his photographs in his dark room, Hartwell noticed something he had missed during his visit. In the background of one image of the dining hall, barely visible in the shadows near a window, was a small face. A child's face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with what appeared to be terror. The image was grainy and indistinct, but unmistakably human and unmistakably desperate. This discovery prompted Hartwell to return to Medina County, but this time he approached his investigation differently. Instead of confronting the Grimbys directly, he spent time in the county seat, carefully questioning longtime residents about their knowledge of the orphanage and its operations. What he learned painted a disturbing picture of community willful ignorance. Sarah Kellerman, who ran the general store and had lived in the area since 1840, admitted that she had always found the Grimby operation peculiar. She explained that while other institutions regularly sent representatives to town for supplies, mail, and social interaction, the Grimsbys conducted all their business through intermediaries or by traveling to distant towns. They never buy children's clothing or toys. She confided to Hartwell during a quiet moment in her store. When they do purchase supplies, it's always adult portions of food, cleaning supplies, and she hesitated, glancing toward the door. They buy a lot of lime, more lime than any farming operation would need. Always ask for it to be delivered directly to their property. Never pick it up themselves. Dr. Twain, Marcus Tilton, the county's physician, provided another piece of the puzzle. Despite being the only doctor within 20 m of the Grimby home, he had never been called to treat any of their children. In 10 years of practice in this county, I've treated injuries and illnesses at every farm, school, and institution in the area, he told Hartwell, except that orphanage. According to the Grimsbys, their children are blessed with perfect health. Not one case of influenza, broken bones, childhood diseases, nothing. It's medically impossible. The weight of mounting evidence compelled Hartwell to take more direct action. In mid-November 1856, he decided to conduct a covert observation of the Grimby property, hoping to document evidence of the children's presence and activities. He positioned himself in a grove of trees approximately 200 wide from the main building, armed with a pair of field glasses borrowed from a Union Army contact. What he observed over 3 days of intermittent surveillance shattered any remaining hope that the Grimby operation was legitimate. The property exhibited none of the normal rhythms of an institution housing dozens of children. No laundry hanging on lines despite the presence of 30 or more residents. No evidence of meal preparation on the scale necessary to feed so many people. Most disturbing, no children ever appeared outdoors during daylight hours. The only regular activity Hartwell witnessed was deeply troubling. Each evening, just after sunset, Caleb Grimby would emerge from the main building carrying what appeared to be bundles wrapped in canvas or burlap. These bundles, varying in size but many disturbingly small, were loaded onto a cart and transported to an area behind the staff quarters, where the property's boundaries disappeared into dense forest. On his third night of observation, Hartwell witnessed something that convinced him to seek immediate official intervention. Shortly after midnight, he observed lights moving in the wooded area where Caleb regularly transported his mysterious bundles. The lights, lanterns, or torches moved in a systematic pattern, suggesting organized activity rather than casual nighttime work. The activity continued for nearly 2 hours, accompanied by sounds that carried faintly through the still air, the rhythmic striking of tools against earth, the scraping of shovels, and occasional voices too distant to understand but urgent in tone. Hartwell's decision to contact Sheriff William Braden proved more complicated than anticipated. Ray Denton, a political appointee more comfortable with tax collection disputes than criminal investigation, initially dismissed Hartwell's concerns as the overactive imagination of a city man unfamiliar with rural ways. The Grims are respected members of this community, Bradenton insisted during their first meeting. They've been caring for unfortunate children for years without a single complaint. However, Hartwell's persistence, combined with the photographic evidence and documented testimonies from local residents, eventually forced Bradenton to take action. The sheriff's reluctance became more understandable when Hartwell learned that Jeremiah Grimby had served as chairman of the county committee that had recommended Bradenton for his position 3 years earlier. The investigation that followed revealed the complex web of political and social connections that had protected the Grimby operation for years. Jeremiah served on the boards of 3 different Methodist churches, contributed generously to local political campaigns, and maintained correspondence with state legislators regarding child welfare policies. His wife, Martha, was a member of various women's charitable organizations, always ready to speak passionately about the family's dedication to caring for society's most vulnerable members. More significantly, The Grimby home's success in placing children with Western families had made it a source of pride for county officials. State inspectors consistently cited the institution as evidence of Ohio's progressive approach to child welfare, and politicians regularly referenced the Grimby success rate in speeches about social reform. Any investigation that revealed problems with the operation would reflect poorly on everyone who had endorsed and supported it. Bradenton's compromise solution was to conduct what he termed a thorough but discreet investigation. Rather than arriving with deputies and search warrants, he would pay an unannounced visit to the Grimby home, ostensibly to discuss routine county business, but actually to observe conditions firsthand. Hartwell would accompany him as a technical advisor, his camera equipment providing a legitimate excuse for documenting any irregularities. The visit, conducted on a gray December morning when snow threatened from heavy clouds, immediately confirmed Hartwell's worst suspicions. The Grimby family's reaction to their unexpected arrival was one of barely controlled panic. Jeremiah, usually composed and authoritative, stammered through explanations for why the building seemed so empty and quiet. Martha disappeared entirely after initial greetings, claiming urgent kitchen duties that couldn't be delayed. Most telling was Caleb's behavior. The younger Grimby, typically intense but controlled, appeared on the verge of physical violence throughout the visit. His hands trembled noticeably as he led them through the same areas Hartwell had photographed months earlier, and his responses to casual questions became increasingly erratic and aggressive. When Sheriff Denton commented on the unusual quiet in a building supposedly housing dozens of children, Caleb's explanation was both detailed and obviously rehearsed. The children were observing a day of silent reflection as part of their moral education, a practice derived from Quaker traditions of contemplative worship. Sheriff Denton's growing suspicions led him to make an unprecedented demand. He insisted on seeing the children regardless of their supposed silent reflection requirements. The request triggered a family conference between the three Grims conducted in urgent whispers near the main staircase, while Bradenton and Hartwell waited in the front parlor. What followed was a carefully choreographed presentation that raised more questions than it answered. The Grimsbys led their visitors to a large room on the second floor where approximately 20 children sat in perfect silence at individual desks. The children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 15, maintained unnatural stillness and avoided eye contact with the visitors. When Bradenton attempted to speak directly to several of them, asking simple questions about their names and how long they had lived at the orphanage, the responses came in barely audible whispers and seemed coached rather than spontaneous. Hartwell noticed several disturbing details during this encounter. Many of the children showed signs of poor health, hollow cheeks, pale complexions, and a general listlessness that suggested malnutrition. More concerning were the visible injuries several children bore: bandages on arms and hands, healing cuts on faces, and in one case, what appeared to be finger-shaped bruises on a young girl's throat. When he attempted to photograph the group, Jeremiah intervened, claiming that the children were too traumatized by their previous experiences to tolerate being photographed by strangers. The most chilling moment came when a boy of perhaps 10 years old, seated in the back row, made direct eye contact with Hartwell. The child's expression was one of desperate hope, as if recognizing that these visitors represented his only chance for rescue. He began to raise his hand, apparently intending to speak, but Caleb moved swiftly to position himself behind the boy's chair. The child immediately lowered his hand and returned his gaze to his desk, his entire body trembling with what appeared to be terror. As they prepared to leave, Hartwell made a strategic decision that would prove crucial to breaking the case. He deliberately left behind his lens cleaning cloth, providing an excuse to return to the building within the hour. When he knocked on the door, claiming to retrieve his forgotten item, Martha Grimby answered alone. Jeremiah and Caleb had departed on an urgent errand to town. Martha's demeanor, without her male relatives present, revealed a woman on the verge of complete psychological collapse. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her speech was rapid and disconnected, and she seemed unable to maintain focus on simple conversation. When Hartwell asked about retrieving his cloth from the classroom, she began to weep, repeatedly apologizing for things she couldn't explain. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, glancing fearfully toward the staircase as if expecting her husband or son to appear. "When we started, Jeremiah said we were helping them. He said the weak ones were suffering and we were ending their suffering, but then it became something else." Before Hartwell could respond to this disturbing confession, the sound of horses approaching sent Martha into a panic. She quickly composed herself, warned Hartwell never to repeat their conversation, and retrieved his cloth from upstairs. By the time Jeremiah and Caleb returned, Martha had returned to her typical withdrawn silence, and Hartwell had departed with information that would reshape the entire investigation. The revelation that the Grims were ending suffering rather than caring for children, prompted Sheriff Braden to seek assistance from the state authorities. However, the political complications surrounding any investigation of such a respected institution meant that outside help would come slowly, if at all. Meanwhile, Hartwell's growing conviction that children were actively being harmed at the Grimby home made waiting for bureaucratic processes feel unconscionable. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Medina County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The decision to conduct a covert nighttime investigation came after Hartwell observed the Grimby property for a fourth time and witnessed activity that left no doubt about the family's criminal intentions. On the night of December 15, 1856, he watched as Caleb emerged from the main building carrying what was unmistakably a child's body, small, limp, wrapped in canvas, and loaded onto the familiar cart for transport to the wooded area. Sheriff Braden's raid on the Grimby home for displaced children began before dawn on December 18, 1856. Armed with hastily obtained warrants and accompanied by 3 deputies borrowed from neighboring counties, Bradenton approached the property as morning fog lifted from the frozen ground. The raid's timing was strategic, early enough to prevent the destruction of evidence, but late enough to avoid the political complications that might arise from a nighttime assault on such a prominent family. Deputy Marshal Thomas Connolly, on loan from Cuyahoga County, had participated in numerous arrests, but later described the approach to the Grimby property as uniquely unsettling. The usual sounds of morning activity, roosters crowing, livestock stirring, smoke rising from chimneys, were entirely absent from the orphanage grounds. Even the winter birds seemed to avoid the area, creating an unnatural silence that made every footstep of their horses sound amplified in the crisp air. As they dismounted near the main building, Edmund Hartwell noticed fresh wagon tracks leading from the main house toward the wooded area behind the property. The tracks were deep, suggesting heavy loads, and appeared to have been made within the past few hours. More disturbing were the dark stains in the snow along the track. Stains that Dr. Tilton would later identify as human blood. The Grimsby's reaction to the arrival of armed lawmen confirmed their guilt more effectively than any evidence could. Jeremiah, typically composed and authoritative, was observed through the front window, frantically throwing papers into the parlor fireplace. When Deputy Connolly pounded on the front door demanding entry in the name of Medina County law, the sounds of destruction continued for nearly 2 minutes before Jeremiah finally opened the door. His appearance shocked even Sheriff Bradenton, who had known the man for years. Jeremiah's usually immaculate clothing was disheveled and stained, his white hair wild and uncombed and his hands visibly trembling as he clutched the doorframe. Most disturbing were his eyes, typically cold and calculating, now darting frantically between the assembled lawmen as if seeking an escape route that didn't exist. "Gentlemen, this is highly irregular," Jeremiah attempted, his voice cracking with strain. "We are a respectable institution endorsed by the state itself. Surely any concerns could be addressed through proper channels rather than this invasion." Sheriff Braden pushed past him into the front hallway, immediately noticing the acrid smell of burning paper and the scattered ash around the fireplace. "Jeremiah Grimby, you are under arrest on suspicion of child abuse, fraud, and murder. Where are Martha and Caleb?" The question triggered a wailing sound from somewhere deeper in the house. Martha's voice, high and keening, calling out phrases that chilled the blood of every man present. "The children in the ground know. They know what we did. God forgive us. They know." Martha was discovered in the kitchen, collapsed on the floor beside an overturned chair, sobbing incoherently while clutching a blood-stained apron to her chest. Her condition was so severe that Dr. Tilton, who had accompanied the raiding party, immediately administered laudanum to prevent her from injuring herself in her hysteria. Between her sobs, she repeatedly confessed to helping them sleep forever and begged forgiveness for following Jeremiah's terrible plan. Most dramatically, Caleb attempted to flee through a rear window on the second floor. Deputy Samuel Pierce, positioned behind the building for precisely this purpose, witnessed the younger Grimby lowering himself from the window while carrying a heavy canvas bag. When Pierce called for him to halt, Caleb dropped to the ground and ran toward the tree, only to be tackled after a brief chase that ended in a frozen creek bed. The canvas bag Caleb had attempted to save contained what would become the most damning evidence in the case: detailed records of the family's activities over the past 5 years, including maps of the burial sites, inventories of personal effects taken from murdered children, and most horrifying, a ledger documenting the sale of children's belongings to unsuspecting merchants in distant towns. The search of the main building began with Sheriff Bradenton and Deputy Connolly examining the first floor, while Hartwell documented everything with his camera equipment. The front parlor, normally maintained in pristine condition for receiving visitors, showed clear signs of recent panic. Partially burned documents littered the fireplace, including fragments of official correspondence with state authorities and what appeared to be financial records detailing payments received for individual children. Among the salvaged papers was a partially destroyed letter from the Ohio Department of Public Welfare dated 6 months earlier praising the Grimby home's exceptional success rate in child placement and recommending increased state funding. The bitter irony of this official endorsement, discovered while searching for evidence of mass murder, would later become a symbol of the system's catastrophic failure to protect vulnerable children. The dining hall yielded evidence of the systematic deception that had fooled inspectors for years. Hidden beneath the main serving counter, deputies discovered sets of plates, cups, and utensils that could be quickly arranged to suggest meals for dozens of children. However, the items showed little wear and no evidence of regular use. More telling were the food stores in the adjacent pantry, enough to feed perhaps 8 people for a month, nowhere near sufficient for the 30 or more children supposedly housed at the institution. Dr. Sturgeon Tilton's examination of the kitchen area revealed additional evidence of the Grimbys' deception. The cooking facilities, while adequate for preparing inspectors' meals or feeding a small family, lacked the capacity to provide regular nutrition for dozens of growing children. The absence of large-scale food preparation equipment, multiple cooking surfaces, or storage for bulk ingredients contradicted every aspect of the orphanage's claimed operations. The second-floor search uncovered the staging area used to create the illusion of a functioning educational institution. The classroom where they had observed 20 children during their previous visit was revealed as an elaborate theatrical set. The desks, while arranged to suggest regular use, contained no personal belongings, completed schoolwork, or evidence of individual students. More disturbing, examination of the desks revealed that many were secured to the floor, presumably to prevent disruption during hastily arranged inspections. Hidden in a storage closet adjacent to the classroom, deputies discovered costumes and props used to create the illusion of a larger student population. Multiple sets of children's clothing in various sizes could be quickly distributed to create the appearance of different children during different inspections. Wigs, makeup, and even simple disguises suggested that the same core group of children had been used repeatedly to portray different students for visiting officials. The discovery of the basement entrance, concealed behind a false wall in the kitchen pantry, marked the moment when suspicion transformed into confirmed horror. Deputy Pierce later described the overwhelming stench that rose from the basement when they first opened the concealed door, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, infection, and something else that defied description but spoke of suffering beyond imagination. The basement itself was a monument to systematic cruelty. 20 children, ranging in age from 7 to 16, were discovered locked in a space originally designed as a root cellar. The area, perhaps 20 feet in pretty 7 Heverty, lacked any source of heating, ventilation, or natural light. A single bucket in one corner served as the only sanitary facility for all 20 children, while another bucket contained water so foul that Dr. Tilton later declared it unfit for animals. The children's condition horrified even the experienced deputies. Most were too weak to stand without assistance, their bodies showing clear evidence of prolonged malnutrition. Their clothing, what little remained, was in tatters, providing no protection against the basement's perpetual dampness and cold. Several children had developed severe infections from untreated wounds, while others showed signs of systematic beating, bruises in various stages of healing, broken bones that had mended improperly, and scars that suggested repeated abuse over months or years. Dr. Tilton's immediate medical assessment revealed the full scope of the horror. These children weren't just neglected, he reported to Sheriff Braden while treating the most severe cases. They were being systematically tortured and starved. Several show evidence of deliberate burns, cuts made with sharp instruments, and injuries consistent with repeated beating. What's most disturbing is that the injuries appear to have been inflicted over an extended period. This wasn't sudden violence, but calculated ongoing torture. Most heartbreaking were the children's reactions to their rescuers. Rather than relief or gratitude, most displayed terror at the appearance of adult men. Several cowed in corners, begging not to be hurt, while others seemed catatonic with trauma. A few of the older children attempted to protect younger ones, forming human shields with their weakened bodies, behavior that spoke of months or years of shared suffering and mutual protection in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Among the rescued children was the boy who had made eye contact with Hartwell during their previous visit, the child whose attempted plea for help had been silenced by Caleb's threatening presence. Now barely conscious and weighing perhaps half what he should for his age, The boy managed to whisper a few words that provided crucial insight into the Grimbys' methods. They pick who dies next. They make us watch. The basement also contained evidence of the Grimbys' systematic record-keeping that would prove crucial during their trial. Hidden beneath loose floorboards were journals and ledgers documenting not just the arrival and disposal of children, but detailed observations of their behavior, health, and what Jeremiah termed their suitability for continued existence. The journals revealed that the operation had begun as what appeared to be legitimate childcare. Early entries from 1851 described genuine efforts to place children with adoptive families, complete with correspondence and follow-up visits. Jeremiah's handwriting from this period showed pride in successful placements and concern for children's welfare. However, beginning in late 1852, the tone and content of the records changed dramatically. The transformation appeared to coincide with financial difficulties and mounting pressure to house more children than the facility could properly accommodate. Entries began describing children as burdens on resources and unlikely to achieve productive adulthood. By 1853, the journals made explicit reference to what Jeremiah termed practical solutions to the problem of defective specimens consuming resources better allocated to the deserving. Most chilling were the detailed criteria developed by the family for determining which children would live and which would die. The records revealed a systematic process of evaluation based on physical appearance, intelligence assessments, compliance with authority, and what Caleb termed moral potential. Children who scored poorly on these arbitrary measures were gradually reduced in rations, denied medical care, and eventually selected for elimination. The journals documented 127 children who had passed through the Grimby home over its 5-year operation. Of these, only the 20 discovered in the basement remained alive. The fate of the other 107 was recorded with scientific precision. Dates of death, methods used, and locations of burial all documented with the clinical detachment of a livestock inventory. Caleb's personal notebooks, discovered in his attempt to flee, provided the most disturbing insights into the psychology behind the murders. His writings revealed a young man convinced that he possessed special abilities to identify genetic and moral defects in children. He described his killings not as murder, but as selective breeding for social improvement and mercy for those incapable of productive existence. The discovery of the burial ground behind the staff quarters provided the physical evidence that transformed the investigation from suspected abuse to confirmed mass murder. The excavation, conducted over 3 days under Dr. Tilton's supervision, revealed 23 graves hastily dug and covered with lime to accelerate decomposition. The systematic nature of the burial site. Graves arranged in neat rows, each marked with a simple wooden stake bearing a number, demonstrated that the killings had been planned and organized, rather than impulsive acts of violence. The bodies showed evidence of prolonged abuse before death, with many displaying healed fractures, malnutrition, and signs of systematic torture. Several of the smallest children appear to have died from starvation and exposure rather than direct violence, while others showed evidence of more active killing, strangulation, blunt force trauma, and in 2 cases, apparent poisoning. Edmund Hartwell's documentation of the excavation created some of the first forensic photographs used in an American criminal trial. His careful recording of each gravesite, the positions of bodies, and the personal effects found with some children provided irrefutable evidence of the systematic nature of the crimes. The photographs captured not only the graves themselves, but also the small treasures buried with some children, handmade toys, letters never sent to relatives, and scraps of fabric that represented their only connections to lives before the Grimby home. Among the most heartbreaking discoveries were attempts by the children to maintain records of their fellow victims. Hidden in the basement, carved into wooden support beams and scratched into the stone walls were names and dates, a memorial created by the survivors to ensure their murdered friends would not be forgotten. These markings provided crucial evidence for identifying victims and establishing timelines for the killings. The interrogation of the captured Grimby family members revealed the full scope of their crimes and the psychology that enabled such systematic cruelty. Jeremiah, faced with overwhelming evidence, initially attempted to maintain his innocence before gradually shifting to justification of his actions. His final confession, delivered over several days of questioning, portrayed the murders as a form of social service designed to prevent suffering and improve society by eliminating defective specimens. His rationalization drew from contemporary theories about heredity and social improvement that were gaining popularity among certain intellectual circles. Jeremiah claimed to have studied the writings of European theorists who advocated selective breeding and elimination of the unfit as methods for improving human society. He argued that the children they had killed were mercy cases who would have lived lives of suffering and dependence, consuming resources better used for healthy, productive citizens. Martha's confession, given between fits of hysteria and religious mania, provided the most disturbing insights into the family's transformation from caregivers to killers. She described how Jeremiah's initial frustration with difficult children had gradually evolved into a philosophical conviction that society had a duty to eliminate those who could not contribute to the common good. Her testimony revealed that she had initially resisted the killings, but was gradually convinced by her husband's arguments and her son's apparent certainty about his ability to identify defective children. Most disturbing was Martha's description of the killing process itself, rather than quick executions. The Grimbys had developed a systematic method of gradual elimination that allowed them to maintain plausible explanations for children's deaths. Selected children would be isolated from the others, given reduced rations, denied medical care for injuries or illnesses, and subjected to increasing abuse until they died from a combination of malnutrition, disease, and trauma. Caleb's interrogation proved the most challenging for investigators, as he never showed remorse for his actions or acknowledged that his behavior was criminal. His responses to questions revealed a young man completely convinced of his own righteousness and frustrated that others couldn't understand the necessity of his work. He described the killings as scientific selection and expressed regret over that he hadn't been able to operate on a larger scale. His detailed descriptions of how he evaluated children for elimination revealed a systematic process based on physical appearance, behavioral observations, and arbitrary assessments of intelligence and moral character. Children who were physically disabled, mentally slow, rebellious against authority, or simply unattractive by his standards were marked for death. He kept detailed notes on each child's defects and used this information to convince his parents that elimination was not only justified but necessary for the good of society. Most chilling was Caleb's matter-of-fact description of the psychological torture he inflicted on selected children before killing them. He would isolate his chosen victims, tell them explicitly that they were going to die because they were worthless, and force them to watch as he killed other children. This process, he explained, served both to break down their resistance and to provide entertainment during the long winter months when outdoor work was impossible. The revelation that some killings had been conducted as public spectacles for the surviving children added another dimension of horror to the case. According to testimony from rescued children, Caleb would sometimes gather the entire group to witness executions, using the deaths as both entertainment and as warnings about the consequences of disobedience. The surviving children's descriptions of these forced viewings provided some of the most damaging testimony against the family during their trial. The trial of the Grimby family began on March 15, 1857, in the Medina County courthouse and quickly became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Ohio's history to that point. The case attracted attention from newspapers across the Midwest and Northeast, with reporters traveling from as far as New York and Boston to cover what many described as the most horrific crimes ever prosecuted in American courts. Judge Harrison Wickham, specially appointed to handle the case due to its complexity and notoriety, faced the challenge of conducting a fair trial while managing unprecedented public interest and outrage. The courthouse, designed to accommodate perhaps 50 spectators, was overwhelmed by crowds numbering in the hundreds who gathered daily hoping to witness the proceedings. Special arrangements had to be made to house visiting reporters and provide security for the defendants who required protection from lynch mobs that gathered outside the courthouse each morning. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Morrison, with assistance from specially appointed prosecutors from the state capitol, faced the challenge of presenting evidence so horrific that some observers questioned whether it could be described in public. The decision to allow Edmund Hartwell's photographs as evidence marked one of the first uses of photographic documentation in an American criminal trial, setting precedents that would influence legal procedures for decades. The photographs themselves proved so disturbing that Judge Wickham ordered the courtroom cleared of women and children before they could be displayed. Even seasoned legal professionals and reporters found the images difficult to view. Photographs of the basement prison, the excavated graves, and the condition of rescued children provided irrefutable documentation of the family's crimes that no amount of testimony could have conveyed as powerfully. Dr. Tilton's medical testimony provided crucial evidence about the systematic nature of the abuse and the deliberate methods used to kill the children. His detailed descriptions of the injuries found on both living and dead children, supported by written medical examinations, demonstrated that the deaths were not accidental or impulsive, but the result of calculated torture designed to inflict maximum suffering over extended periods. The testimony of the rescued children proved to be the most emotionally powerful evidence presented during the trial. Several of the older survivors, despite their trauma, were able to provide detailed accounts of life in the Grimby basement and witness testimony about specific killings they had been forced to observe. Their descriptions of the family's methods, the psychological torture inflicted on victims, and the systematic nature of the selection process provided the prosecution with evidence that corroborated the physical findings and documentary evidence. One of the most compelling witnesses was Margaret Henley, a 13-year-old girl who had survived nearly 2 years in the Grimby basement. Despite her ordeal, Margaret possessed remarkable composure and clarity in describing the horrors she had witnessed. Her testimony about watching younger children die from starvation and abuse, delivered in a clear, steady voice that contrasted sharply with her emaciated appearance, reduced many courtroom observers to tears. Margaret's description of Caleb's selection process proved particularly damaging to the defense. She testified that he would regularly examine the children like livestock, checking their teeth, observing their behavior, and making notes in his journals about their fitness for continued existence. Children who showed signs of illness, disability, or defiance were marked for elimination through a process that could take weeks or months of gradual starvation and increasing abuse. The defense strategy, hampered by the overwhelming evidence against their clients, focused primarily on claims of mental incompetence and religious delusion. Jeremiah's attorney, William Henderson from Cleveland, argued that his client had been driven to madness by the overwhelming burden of caring for society's most damaged children. The stress of operating an underfunded institution, combined with exposure to the traumatic histories of his charges, had allegedly caused a mental breakdown that rendered him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Martha's defense, conducted by attorney James Patterson, relied heavily on claims of feminine weakness and domination by her male relatives. Patterson argued that Martha had been psychologically controlled by her husband and son, lacking the mental capacity to resist their influence or understand the criminal nature of their actions. Her apparent mental collapse during and after the arrest was presented as evidence of her fundamental inability to participate meaningfully in the planning or execution of the crimes. Caleb's defense proved the most challenging, as his detailed records and unrepentant attitude made claims of insanity difficult to support. His attorney, Robert Chase, attempted to argue that his client's actions, while extreme, were based on legitimate scientific theories about social improvement and selective breeding that were gaining acceptance among intellectual circles. This approach backfired when the prosecution demonstrated that Caleb's methods bore no resemblance to any legitimate scientific theory and were motivated by sadistic pleasure rather than social philosophy. The prosecution's presentation of the documentary evidence found in Caleb's notebooks proved devastating to this defense strategy. His detailed descriptions of the pleasure he derived from torturing and killing children, combined with his elaborate fantasies about expanding his work to larger populations, demonstrated clearly that his actions were motivated by sadistic impulses rather than any coherent social theory. The trial's most dramatic moment came when the prosecution presented Caleb's own words describing his ultimate goals for his selective breeding program. In writings discovered in his personal effects, he had outlined plans for establishing similar institutions across Ohio and eventually throughout the Midwest, creating a network of facilities that would systematically eliminate children deemed unfit for productive existence. His vision included detailed organizational charts, funding proposals, and recruitment strategies for like-minded individuals who could assist in implementing his program on a national scale. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 4 hours, and remarkably short time for a case of such complexity. Their unanimous verdict found all 3 defendants guilty on multiple counts of murder with additional convictions for fraud, child abuse, and conspiracy. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the community's outrage at the defendants' crimes. The sentencing phase revealed the error's different standards for male and female culpability. Judge Wickham sentenced both Jeremiah and Caleb to death by hanging, declaring that their crimes represented such a fundamental violation of civilized society that no other punishment could serve justice. Martha, deemed mentally incompetent and influenced by her male relatives, received life imprisonment, a sentence that reflected contemporary beliefs about women's limited capacity for independent moral action. Jeremiah's execution on September 12, 1857, drew thousands of spectators to Columbus, where public hangings regularly attracted large crowds. His final statement, delivered from the gallows, attempted once more to justify his actions as necessary social reform. Future generations will understand that we were pioneers in improving the human condition, he declared. The weak must be culled so that the strong may flourish. Our only error was in being born before our time. Caleb's execution, conducted the same day, provided a stark contrast to his father's attempt at philosophical justification. His final words revealed the true nature of his motivation. I regret only that I was stopped before completing my work. The pleasure I derived from their suffering was worth any punishment you might impose. These words, reported in newspapers across the nation, helped establish the case as a landmark example of what would later be recognized as serial killing, motivated by sadistic pleasure rather than any rational purpose. Martha's imprisonment proved brief as her mental condition deteriorated rapidly in the Ohio State Prison for Women. According to prison records, she spent her days alternating between periods of catatonic silence and violent episodes, during which she would scream about the children in the ground and beg forgiveness from voices only she could hear. She died in 1863 officially from pneumonia, though prison physicians noted that she had essentially wasted away from an inability to eat or care for herself. The 20 children rescued from the Grimby basement required months of medical treatment and psychological care before they could be placed in legitimate orphanages or with foster families. Dr. Treff Tilton's detailed medical records documented their recovery process, providing some of the earliest systematic observations of trauma recovery in children. Several never fully recovered from their ordeal, carrying physical disabilities and emotional scars throughout their lives. Margaret Henley, the 13-year-old whose testimony had been so crucial during the trial, eventually recovered sufficiently to be placed with a farming family in western Ohio. She lived to adulthood, married, and had children of her own. But according to family records, she never spoke about her experience at the Grimby home after the trial concluded. Her descendants, interviewed decades later, described her as a loving but intensely protective mother who never allowed her children to be alone with adults outside the immediate family. The investigation's aftermath revealed troubling gaps in Ohio's oversight of charitable institutions that extended far beyond the Grimby case. A comprehensive review ordered by the state legislature discovered that dozens of similar institutions operated with minimal oversight, relying primarily on self-reporting and infrequent inspections conducted with advance notice. The Grimby case had demonstrated how easily such a system could be manipulated by criminals willing to invest effort in maintaining appearances. The reforms implemented in response to the case established new requirements for surprise inspections, mandatory reporting of child deaths and transfers, and verification of claimed placements with adoptive families. Most significantly, the new regulations required institutions to maintain detailed medical records for each child and to report immediately any child who died or was transferred to other care arrangements. Edmund Hartwell's role in exposing the crimes earned him recognition as a pioneer in forensic photography, but the experience took a severe personal toll. His detailed documentation of the excavation, the basement prison, and the condition of the rescued children provided crucial evidence for the prosecution, but the images he captured haunted him for the rest of his life. In later interviews, he described the case as both his greatest professional achievement and his most traumatic personal experience. The photographic techniques Hartwell developed during the investigation established precedents for crime scene documentation that influenced police procedures throughout the Midwest. His systematic approach to recording evidence, measuring crime scenes, and creating comprehensive visual records became a model for other photographers working with law enforcement agencies. However, the psychological impact of documenting such extreme cruelty led him to abandon forensic work entirely, returning to his original specialty of architectural and landscape photography. The Grimby home property itself became a lasting reminder of the crimes committed there. The county seized the buildings and land as part of the criminal proceedings, but disposing of the property proved complicated. Local residents refused to purchase land associated with such horrific crimes, and the buildings were eventually demolished in 1858 rather than allowed to stand as monuments to the family's evil. Even after demolition, the site remained disturbing to local residents. The burial ground, despite the removal of bodies to a proper cemetery, was avoided by hunters and travelers who reported an overwhelming sense of unease when passing through the area. Local folklore developed around the property with stories of strange sounds and unexplained phenomena, though these tales reflected community trauma rather than any supernatural occurrences. The graves of the murdered children were relocated to Woodland Cemetery in Medina, where they were marked with simple stones bearing only numbers rather than names. The decision to use numbers reflected the sad reality that many of the children's original identities had been systematically erased by their killers. Jeremiah's record-keeping, while thorough in documenting the crimes, had deliberately obscured the victims' backgrounds to make their disappearances less likely to be noticed. Community efforts to identify the murdered children continued for years after the trial, as families from across Ohio and neighboring states came forward with information about missing children who might have been victims of the Grimby operation. Some identifications were successful, allowing proper names to be added to grave markers, but many of the victims remained anonymous, a final victory for their killers' systematic dehumanization. The case files, including Hartwell's photographs, the family's journals, and transcripts of the trial proceedings, were sealed in county archives immediately after the executions. The decision to restrict access reflected community desire to move past the traumatic events, but it also prevented researchers from studying the case for potential insights into criminal psychology and institutional abuse. When the files were finally opened in 1925, they provided historians and criminologists with unprecedented documentation of 19th-century serial killing and institutional abuse. The detailed records left by the Grimby family, combined with the systematic documentation of the investigation, offered unique insights into the psychology of family-based criminal enterprises and the social conditions that enabled such crimes to continue undetected. Modern analysis of the case has identified it as an early example of what criminologists now recognize as institutional serial killing. Crimes committed by individuals who use positions of authority over vulnerable populations to select and murder victims over extended periods. The Grimby family's methods, motivations, and psychological profiles became important case studies in the development of criminal psychology and the understanding of how seemingly normal individuals can commit extraordinary evil. The broader implications of the Grimby case extended beyond criminal justice to fundamental questions about society's responsibility for its most vulnerable members. The family's ability to operate undetected for 5 years, despite numerous warning signs and opportunities for intervention, highlighted systemic failures that extended far beyond individual criminal behavior. Most disturbing was the revelation that the Grimbys' crimes were enabled not by their isolation from the community, but by their successful integration into its social, religious, and political structures. Their respectability, charitable reputation, and apparent success in their mission had provided perfect cover for activities that violated every principle they claimed to represent. This paradox forced uncomfortable questions about the relationship between public virtue and private behavior that resonated far beyond the immediate case. The psychological profiles developed during the trial revealed patterns of behavior that would later be recognized as characteristic of family-based criminal enterprises. Jeremiah's role as the ideological leader who provided intellectual justification for the crimes. Martha's position as the reluctant enabler whose compliance made the operation possible, and Caleb's function as the primary executioner who derived personal satisfaction from the violence, demonstrated how family dynamics could be corrupted to enable systematic evil. The case also illuminated the dangers of unchecked authority over dependent populations, particularly when combined with social isolation and inadequate oversight. The Grimby family's crimes were made possible by their complete control over their victims, who had no means of communicating with the outside world or seeking help from authorities. This dynamic would later be recognized as a common element in institutional abuse cases, leading to reforms designed to ensure that vulnerable populations maintain some connection to independent advocates. The financial aspects of the case revealed another dimension of the family's criminality that extended beyond the murders themselves. Investigation of their records showed that they had systematically defrauded both state agencies and private donors by claiming to care for children they had actually killed. The money intended to provide food, clothing, medical care, and education for dozens of children had instead been diverted to support the family's lifestyle and fund their criminal activities. More disturbing was the discovery that the Grimbys had sold personal belongings taken from murdered children to merchants in distant towns, creating a secondary revenue stream from their crimes. Clothing, jewelry, toys, and other possessions were systematically collected from victims and sold as far away as Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, ensuring that evidence of the crimes were scattered beyond the reach of local investigators. The legal precedents established by the case influenced criminal jurisprudence for decades, particularly regarding the use of photographic evidence in the prosecution of crimes committed within family units. The court's decision to admit Hartwell's photographs as evidence helped establish photography as a legitimate tool for documenting criminal activity. While the prosecution's success in securing convictions against all 3 family members demonstrated that domestic relationships did not provide immunity from criminal responsibility, the case also contributed to evolving understanding of criminal conspiracy and the legal responsibility of individuals who enable crimes committed by others. Martha Grimby's conviction, despite her apparent mental instability and claims of coercion, established important precedents regarding the criminal liability of those who facilitate crimes through passive cooperation or willful ignorance. Educational institutions began incorporating the Grimby case into curricula for training social workers, institutional administrators, and government inspectors. The systematic failures that enabled the crimes to continue provided powerful lessons about the importance of thorough oversight, independent verification of institutional claims, and the need for vulnerable populations to maintain connections with advocates outside their immediate care arrangements. Religious communities across Ohio and beyond grappled with the implications of crimes committed by individuals who had successfully portrayed themselves as devout Christians engaged in charitable work. The case forced uncomfortable examinations of how religious authority and charitable reputation could be manipulated to provide cover for criminal activity, leading to calls for increased transparency and accountability in religiously affiliated institutions. The impact on child welfare policy extended far beyond Ohio's borders as other states examined their own oversight systems in light of the Grimby revelations. The case became a catalyst for nationwide reforms in institutional regulation, inspection procedures, and record-keeping requirements that improve protection for vulnerable children throughout the United States. Perhaps most importantly, the Grimby case served as an early warning about the potential for evil to disguise itself as virtue and the dangers of assuming that charitable intentions automatically produce charitable outcomes. The detailed documentation of how a respected family could systematically murder the children entrusted to their care provided a sobering reminder that society's most vulnerable members are often at greatest risk from those who claim to protect them. This mystery shows us how easily evil can disguise itself as charity, and how society's most vulnerable members often pay the price for our willingness to trust without verifying. The Grimby family's crimes were enabled not by their isolation from their community, but by their successful integration into it, a reminder that the greatest horrors often hide behind the most respectable facades. The systematic nature of their crimes, the calculated cruelty of their methods, and the complete absence of remorse they displayed forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that exists even in those we trust most. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could such systematic evil exist in our own communities today, hidden behind facades of respectability and charity? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.